Today, we have the pleasure of being joined by Steve Hall, founder of Revive Stronger. Steve, what's going on, man? Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me. As we're just talking off air, I'm in the cold London at the moment, so it's I wish I was somewhere a little bit warmer. But I think it's like a British thing talking about the weather. I don't know. Like it's like the first thing that comes to mind. Hey, I'm a little bit chilly.
My
Well,
family's British, so I get it.
yeah, anyone that I know that's from the UK, usually they're just like, another gray day today, you know?
Yeah, dull, drizzly. That's pretty much London weather for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not the best.
We've got a very gray, wet day today in Geneva as well. Before we started, actually, before you hopped on, Ryan and I were having a little bit of a chat about who you are, your story, and some of the things that we find particularly interesting about you. So we were talking behind your back in the best of ways. And one of the topics that came up was how curious you are, seemingly how insatiably curious you are, and how much you just like consistently experiment, in particular with your own training. And then I'm assuming then that would flow outwards with your clients. And I was hoping we could start there today to like how important is experimentation and maintaining curiosity for you, and how do you go about practicing that in your professional life?
Great question. Yeah, I think it's something that I'm really big on, is like that anti-dogma type of thing. I've never really found myself within a group, and I'm really glad about that. And in some ways, I understand why groups are so attractive and appealing, because at many times it's uncomfortable being outside of one. I can see just like religion comes to mind immediately. Like they're all like love and have all that kind of closeness, and they all support one another, and they're almost not anti other things. Like religion's not a great one to go. Well, some religions maybe are, but in some
Yeah.
groups and group think, they end up being anti other things, and that really brings people close together, and that can be really dangerous. But to be in it can feel really confirming, and it can make you very confident. And being underconfident and being unknowing is something that's really uncomfortable for people. When I think about evidence-based practice, I think about Brad Schoenfeld almost immediately. And I think about the way that he talks about what we know. And when I ever get to interview him and ask him questions, he's so careful with the language he uses. And I think a lot of people, well, I know a lot of people, they'll be in the comments being like, man, that's such a wide range, or man, you sound so uncertain. And it's like, but we don't know for certain. Like science is ever trying to get closer to the truth. It isn't the truth. And there are some big principles that we know and love, and I think that's important to hold on to. But past that point, there's so many unknowns, especially in like exercise science. There's something obviously we're all massively passionate about. It's relatively new, and there's a lot of studies coming out now. But like a decade ago, there was so much less. There was way less people in the field. Whereas you've got people coming up now who are maybe in their 20s, mid 20s, getting PhDs in this field and like expanding and growing. Whereas in the past, we only had like, I don't know, a handful of guys in that space. So I think just because there's so much opportunity to learn, it's, just been something that I'm very careful not to find myself in a position of ignorance, because it is not bliss in that sense. And it will hold me back. I know it will. And I've applied things that I've learned early within my kind of lifting career that were quote unquote evidence-based. Like the immediate one that comes to mind is like meeting macros and flexible dieting. And that was just such a huge game changer for me in terms of making bodybuilding much more of a lifestyle versus like something I had to like conform to. And I had these special foods that were like building and my physique. And it actually made me better as a bodybuilder. I could learn about different ways of doing things and what was driving results ultimately. So I've just always been super, super curious. Kind of the phrase never knowing, but always like learning comes to mind. Like it's just one of those.
Cool.
The thing I'm careful about is, especially with clients, is that, and you can't come across as a coach, like, hey, we don't know anything and all of that. So I'm very careful about, and I think it's clear with my content, but we have these big principles, but past that point, there's many roads to Rome. So we have some big principles with training, big principles with nutrition, but other than that, you can very much individualize it, or we learn something slightly better than another thing. And even with the new science that comes out, nothing's like a game changer. I don't know if you guys have seen it. You probably have. If you haven't, you'll see it soon. This kind of new discussion on protein intakes and what's
Yeah.
optimal for hypertrophy. And this is Menno, Greg Knuckles just came out with an article. Milo kind of spurred this, saying like we've been kind of undershooting protein recommendations. Maybe it's like, I think some people might see that and be like, man, scientists again. Like the bros knew after all it was always high protein. But I think it's just when you actually drill down to it, it's like, I mean, it's like it's tiny. It isn't like a big deal. It's not like a game changer. It's not suddenly you're going to grow tons more muscle if you increase your protein ever so slightly or what have you. And even there's some uncertainty. I know Greg said he's not ready to like change the macro factor algorithm or anything like that. So it's just like I find those discussions fun and interesting because I have a backbone of just confidence in the big principles and doing a lot of things right. Whereas I think some people find that really kind of almost scary. So then that does put them in a camp of just like, hey, I'm just a bro. I'm going to follow what the bros always did. Success leaves clues. What did the successful ones do? I'm just going to copy them. And there's going to be some stuff they did right, but there's going to be some stuff that they didn't do right. I think I actually read it today. Greg said something along the lines of even a broken clock is right twice a day. And I love that. I haven't heard that said for a while, but it's such a good saying. So in terms of applying it to clients, I definitely use myself as the first kind of point of experimentation, probably similar to you guys. You don't want to give clients something that you haven't tried and experimented with. You kind of want to get to grips with it. It shocks me sometimes some programs I see from like clients or in consultations, and a coach has given them this to do. And I'm like, I don't think that person has ever done this workout. Like that coach can't have done this workout because it just fundamentally doesn't make sense. So like if you give clients workouts and you've ran something very similar, you can be very confident they can do that and execute it. But in theory, you could build some very convoluted, productive workout that actually in practice is complete garbage. Or, I don't know, a meal plan and it has very specific nutrient timing and it just isn't kind of individualized to that person. Actually, one that comes to mind is I just came off bodybuilding prep and did rapid backload with Cliff. And I have ran a rapid backload with a client before, but not the way Cliff does it necessarily. And so it was really, I wanted that hands-on experience with Cliff before I maybe was to use this with other people. And man, there's a lot going on within that rapid backload. And I now know some people it would be suitable to, and there's some people that absolutely wouldn't be. So you always use myself as that place of experimentation has been so helpful because it just allows me to, give it to clients in a more refined and practical way. And also, not that if it doesn't work for me, it's not going to work for them, but we all have our own biases and preferences, and they'll bring those to the table too. And I won't ignore those. And that is something I've been bad of in the past. I could specifically remember Mike Israetel, for example. I don't know if he still says this, but he's not the biggest fan of leg extensions. He just never really found them to be super productive for him. And I was just like, I think I took that as leg extensions aren't good for muscle growth. And so I just didn't really use leg extensions very much, even though I was like, man, leg extensions give me a gnarly pump. I really like them. They're a great way to add additional stimulus for like very little fatigue. And then like years down the line, I'm like, why did I ever just like rule those out from programs? That was such a silly thing to do. And again, that was my like monkey brain probably kicking in of just dogma. Follow this guru, going to give you the answers, and don't follow other people. And so the podcast has been a great way of making sure I don't do that by bringing on different people and exploring those avenues and exposing myself even to people who I don't necessarily agree with all the time, or at least agree with at that moment, and give them an opportunity to explain it further to me. So Coach Kassem comes to mind as someone who initially I was kind of a little bit like, he's kind of a bit counter to some of the things I thought I knew and the ways I like to go about things. But I made sure that I'm not going to just ignore this individual. They're coming from a good place. And so the more I took his information in, learned it, applied it, spoke to him, the more I was like, hey, man, I'm so glad that I didn't just rule him out because I would have been missing out on this. Now, I haven't applied this, but I can kind of pick and choose from various experts what's seemingly driving results best for me and my clients. So, yeah, that's kind of where my thought process goes and how I end up at trying to apply it to my clientele.
I love
Something,
it. If you don't mind, Ryan, I have a quick
yeah, go
little
ahead.
follow-up question. So you mentioned a lot of things there that for me really speak to me. Initially, I was like, oh, or you said something like a few minutes ago. I'm like, right, I'm going to circle back to this. Then you mentioned something else. I'm like, fuck, now I need to talk about this.
I
So,
know that
but
feeling.
but there's one in particular that stands out to me at this point. You mentioned Mike Israetel mentioning his preference of doing things, doesn't love leg extensions, and you, I'm assuming like this was earlier in your career, of course, took that as being like, oh, this is perhaps not as optimal or ideal or as useful for me, and so I'm just going to essentially discard it because of what this person said. And I don't want to put words in your mouth. That's kind of what I heard. And um, for me, that reflects something that is very important for me as an educator as well, which is why like we know that fitness professionals who are perhaps earlier on in their career, just kind of starting to get their feet wet, will look up to people that have more experience. And they tend to take what we say at face value. And sometimes they don't take it with the context that we perhaps assume is presupposed and perhaps obvious, which is why I really try to, anytime that I teach any of my students, I try to tell them from the beginning that it's like, listen, like, at the beginning of your journey, and I don't know if you would agree with this, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Like at the beginning of your journey, if all you have is nuance and there's no like big rocks or clarity of certain things that might be perhaps more important than others and perhaps when, it becomes next to impossible to make decisions when you're at the beginning of your career. And so systems are really important, generally speaking. And there tends to be an over reliance on systems, generally speaking, within the industry. Lots of black and white thinking, see X, do Y type of fitness protocols. And I think it's really important as a leader in the fitness space, and I very much consider you as being one, to model to model critical thinking, and sometimes even to say like just overtly like this work, I don't like this for these reasons, but it doesn't mean that it's a bad exercise, and here's when you might use it, et cetera, because we want to make sure that we're forming the industry in a manner that's going to be kind of net positive in the long run, and that we're forging or creating minds that are flexible in contrast to rigid. And it really seems like we have some of that in common.
For sure. Yeah. And the immediate thing that comes to mind, unfortunately, in this day and age with short form content, so not this, thankfully, if
Yeah.
people are listening to this, they're not really the people we're maybe targeting as much with this comment. But on Instagram, I'm not on TikTok, but TikTok, I'm on Threads. So again, it's all short form content. And people just get sound bites. And so it might be that you speak on a 2 hour long podcast, but someone takes like this little segment and it's completely out of context. And then someone onlooking just watches that and they're like, oh, so like that's the take home for them. And now it's just, yeah, it taken out of context, that can be really, really dangerous. And then they get that soundbite and then they parrot it. And then it just becomes this like parroted thing that's said. And when something's said enough, it can very often become truth. And that's scary. And I'm really grateful for people like Eric Trexler, for example. As an example, I know P ratios, like partitioning ratios, were a thing that I used to be like, hey, the leaner I am to a point, the better I'll partition nutrients towards muscle versus fat. And that was kind of gospel to some extent. I think that's what the majority of the fitness industry thought was like, hey, being leaner was a good idea. And you want to get lean before you bulk because that's going to make the muscle gaining phase more efficient. And then you get Eric Trexler who looks at that and is like skeptical. Have we actually looked into that? What studies are being used to promote that? And then he finds out actually doesn't seem to really be that much truth to it. So I'm so grateful for people like that. But you also have to be ready if you are truly evidence-based to change your opinion on it. One that always comes to mind, I know Lane Norton was big on like BCAAs at some point, and he would
Totally.
promote those. And I understand because that was like part of his PhD was protein, and they were kind of exciting for a moment in time. But new evidence came out and was like, hey, if you're eating enough protein, probably not something you need to worry about. He doesn't promote BCAAs. If you ask him about him, he'd say he changed his opinion on it. And so, yeah, you never really want to build your business or coaching business based off like something that is like that can change. And so that's something to be careful of as, yeah, someone rising up within the space. I know for a time, I actually made a joke at the time where flexible dieting was really big, again, like maybe 5-10 years ago. And you'd get all these coaches coming into the space and they'd be like, I don't know, ice cream for PRs or something like this. So there's probably actually a business called that, but just names because it was like that was the cool, exciting thing. And I don't know, now we look at it, it's like, there's like pros and cons to meal plans versus flexible dieting versus if it fits your macros, or like loads of diets can be successful. It's kind of the right tool for the job. And so, yeah, you just don't want to base your whole identity around a single thing, ideally, and you want to be open minded to other things. But I think something that you said there, ET, that was important was understanding those core basic principles. Because again, if you are that coach that doesn't talk about those, and you can then sound really underconfident in what you're doing because you're like, I'm just open-minded to everything. It's like, well, what do you know to be true? Like, how are you driving results? Like, what are the key fundamentals that you're focusing on? And so I always try and draw back to those and try and establish with people a bias, but and keep that in perspective myself, like internally, because I know I've got some biases where, as an example, I came up and it was very much like meal plans, these foods, not these foods, like clean, dirty. And I probably could have been diagnosed with like orthorexia at the time, where I had this fundamental obsession with clean eating. I would take Tupperware with my food to cousins, to like occasions, stuff like this. It was very extreme. And I'd get like quite stressed and anxious if I wasn't able to eat those foods. And since then, discovering if it fits your macros and flexible dieting, I was very much against it. And then I slowly incorporated it as I understood the science and things like this. And I saw really good results. So now I have quite a strong affiliation with being flexible with your nutrition and variation. So much so that when I see some stuff coming out where it's like, I don't know, artificial sweeteners are the devil, or highly processed foods are terrible in like every situation and inherently bad, it really gets my back up, because I'm like, that is going to drive people into orthorexia, to the point where maybe that bias, I needed to rein, I might need to rein it in at some point, where it's like, actually, you could meet a threshold of artificial sweeteners that's bad, and that could be individual, person to person. Maybe there's some gut health consequences that come out that we learn more about, or maybe some food processing is like inherently a bad thing, like trans fats, for example. Like, yeah, maybe avoid those. So I'm always careful to try and, yeah, make myself uncomfortable, like I did with Kasim, and I followed him and I allowed him to kind of occupy my mind in many ways, versus just like rule out these things. So that's a little bit of how I go about it.
It's a really great reminder.
Something you had said there about the flexible dieting and looking at processed foods, etc., is actually very analogous actually to a conversation that ET and I have a lot in the courses that we teach about the dialogue around exercise and maybe people's potential injury history, and not using language that's really catastrophic, that is almost speaking as though their bodies are really fragile. But I think there's a very similar parallel to nutrition as well.
I'd agree.
As you said, if you have somebody who is maybe very similar to you when you were younger, and you give them almost this like death scare of these certain foods, you create this scenario where probably the psychological stress around their food is a net negative, even if they're eating these quote unquote healthy foods or clean foods. And I think very similar to yourself, I think as I've gotten into the bodybuilding space, having more of a flexible, people want to say 80-20 approach to dieting, whatever. I think that the lack of stress from eating that way is probably a net positive. Something I think about clients, I'm sure you have this as well, Steve, clients eating out at a restaurant, for example. And that can be a really stressful situation. And it's like, okay, if you were going to have, chicken, potatoes, and some veggies at home, and you go to a restaurant, you have steak, and like there's still protein, there's still fats in it, there's still, whatever. Like that single meal just isn't going to cause that much damage. And if anything, like you're still getting nutrients in, and you're having this social event. So I only wanted to touch on that because I actually think that there's a really powerful conversation around the psychological part of diet coaching, and maybe we'll touch on that later. Something that I wanted to circle back on, because you had talked about Kasim in particular as a guest, kind of pushing you outside of your comfort zone. And then we've followed each other on social media for years. I've seen a lot of the things that you've done where you've taken certain suggestions or ideas that you've had from guests and implemented them and experimented with them in your own training. So I had actually a list of a couple that I thought were noteworthy that maybe I wanted you to talk about your experiences and maybe your opinions on them, maybe having shifted after you've played around with them a bit in your own training. So the first one, and I think it's maybe the buzzword right now in sort of the hypertrophy space, but I know you implemented some lengthened partials and played around with where and when they might fit in your training. Can you talk about what that experience has been and maybe the conclusions you've drawn?
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, man, lengthened partials, they have been in vogue for a long time now. When I actually reflect upon how long I've been experimenting with lengthened partials, it could even be coming to like 3 years. Like when those first papers came out on the calves, I don't know what year they were published, but it could be good 3 years ago now. So I have been using a lot of lengthened partials within my training for an extended period of time. And particularly on the calves, the data is very convincing, and they're the most heavily researched muscle. And the theory also really stands up where I had already kind of got rid of bent knee calf raises from my training for the longest time because I was like, man, my calves barely grow anyway. In a bent knee position, I'm really biasing that soleus portion, right? Which is kind of the muscle you don't really care as much about. You want the chunk of the muscle to grow, that gastroc. And so I was always just focused on straight leg variants anyway. So then when that kind of recent research came out, they kind of said, hey, you're going to grow both pretty well from straight leg variants, and then not so much the gastroc from the bent knee variant. Is kind of like, that's cool. And actually, to talk about Kasim, that's the kind of there's the people that will say like the bros already kind of knew this, and it's kind of like he could almost in some situations be like the biomechanics already knew this, because a lot of the results that we're seeing you could almost explain without having done the experiment. Now, you never want to do that, but like, hey, in a bent knee position, of course, you're not going to be training the gastroc very well. You're not stretching maybe the soleus out as well, but it's good to have the actual data to support that. And yeah, so I started doing it there with some lengthened partials. And then there were just some muscles where it made sense that it might be very effective. So, for example, the back, the delts, where the muscle, generally muscles are strongest at length or in the mid portion. And so when you are doing a lot of dumbbell lateral raises for, say, for the side delts, where it's hardest up at the top and you're not really getting much load in that lengthened position, it makes sense to transition towards cables. And then with the back, again, it being hardest at full stretch, hardest in the short position. I used to be really big on, like, again, bring up Mike Israetel, team full ROM, got to bring that lat pull down to clavicle. If I don't touch, that's failure. It's like, man, how many reps can I get? Like maybe 5 lengthened partials at the end of that if I keep going. And so it's like, when I, again, boiling it back to big principles, taking muscles close to failure is very important for muscle growth. So if I'm actually leaving 5 reps there where the back could keep milking out, maybe I'm doing more volume than I need to because I'm making up for that lack of intensity. And so kind of just drawing it back to almost first principles in a sense. And so it's like, hey, okay, maybe I try it for back, delts. Maybe I try it on exercises where the short position is hardest, because the data seems to be trendy in that direction. And it wasn't suddenly like I switched my whole program to lengthened partials. My whole program isn't lengthened partials. It's definitely lengthened biased for the most part. But and I'm careful not to go, again, you see one paper and you're like, I'm going to change everything to this. It's not a good idea to have that paradigm shift. As I said, kind of full ROM has been the way to go for the longest time, because that's what a lot of the data was saying. But it's because a lot of the lengthened partial research was looking at short partials, and so they seem to be underperforming versus full ROM. So that stretch position seemed to be very important. And like you guys have said, like I talked to so many people. There must be 10 to 20 people, experts on the podcast that I've done podcasts literally on lengthened partials and wanted to gain their perspective and thoughts behind it. And there's differing opinions on the importance or not the importance. Some people are like all the way in, like Milo would be all the way in. Joe Jeffries was like all the way in. I think he switched his whole program that way. Whereas then you had, I remember Eric Trexler being like, I can't see me ever doing only lengthened partials. I just can't see that actually happening. So it's kind of interesting to see the like diverse views and perspectives. And again, I don't want to lose out because we don't have sufficient data to say, hey, you can just drop short positions altogether or anything like that. But I also like using my own training as feedback and kind of using yourself as your own case study, like you do with every client. N equals one. What might work for one person isn't going to work for another person, and just leaning into that and following your own data, like along with the scientific research, which might just nudge you in a direction. It's like, oh, I already thought that with the straight leg calf raise. Now I'm just going to chop out the top position. My calves haven't been grown anyway, so let's try this. Interesting enough, on the calves, they are the muscle that has definitely seen, like, it's probably because they were quite undertrained for multiple reasons, but they have grown significantly. I can look down at my calves now and be like, dude, you have a set of calves. How cool
My
is
man.
that?
My
No one
man.
gives a shit but me. And I was slowly in the process of covering them up with tattoos as well. And now I'm like, man, do I want to cover that with a tattoo? I don't know. It's kind of cool when it's lean. I probably will. But yeah, it's. I always like to bring it back to first principles. Like, why in theory would these be working? And as Cassim would say, fuck around and find out. I think way too many people are waiting for a study to try something within their training or with their nutrition.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, just give it a go. You guys probably get it maybe from clients or people across social media. They're like, should I do this or should I do this? And it's like, they're both fundamentally like not flawed. Give it a go, see how it goes. And whichever one
Yeah.
feels better or works better for you, that's probably the way to go, because we're all that built a little bit differently anyway. And so kind of lean into that. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts about lengthened partials, at least in some sort of summary.
Very, very briefly, before I kind of ask the next one, what you said there, just about clients kind of asking, should I do this or should I do this? Again, I'm sure all of us and every other coach experiences this, where clients will get really fixated on something that we know isn't really that big a deal. I think within the last couple of days, like I had a client reach out to me because one of the meals he really likes is like fat-free Greek yogurt, some protein, berries, whatever. And he was really stressed which protein would be, like which protein powder was the best to mix with Greek yogurt. My answer was the one that you like the best. Like, it doesn't matter. It's just that won't be the thing that makes or breaks your progress. But I think people get so fixated and stressed that if they don't do this one, like minute detail, then all of their gains are going to be gone. The other thing I wanted to talk about, we were chatting about this before you came on, Steve, that I also think was really interesting is I believe within the last year, you've been training legs 3 times a week, which I think, especially for trained individuals and people who are stronger, is quite unusual. Could you talk about your experience training legs and maybe what like how you had to allocate volume throughout the week, how recovery was, etc.?
Yeah, for sure. So pretty much for my whole off season from 2021 to this prep was 3 times a week upper body, 3 times a week lower body, pretty much the entire off season. So I actually only recently, in the last few months of prep, moved to push pull legs. So I am currently on a lower frequency, and that was because it was just torture doing 3 times a week lower body. It was just mentally in prep. I was not there for it, and also my volume demands, because my recovery was just so much lower. My total volume wasn't at a point where I needed to spread it over that many days. But what really led me down that route was I was finding, particularly for my back, which I had identified as kind of somewhere I needed to bring up, and my quads, 2 areas I really wanted to bring up, was for width, basically, because I have a bit of a wider waist. I'm not blessed with these like crazy genetics. You see some people with like the smallest
Like
waist, or
Jared.
like Jared, Keown, like, geez, these
Yeah.
guys like with nothing waists. It has. I actually made a joke. I was like, if you were to give me, like, without seeing the bodybuilders on stage, but give me like a shoulder to waist ratio, I could almost predict the like top 5 just based off like a shoulder to waist ratio. That's how important it is, that structure.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I need more of this. So yeah, side delts along with that were some of my priorities. And I just found my back just never really took very long to recover, didn't really get very sore. And so I was like, hey, you can do like 2 more kind of lat width biased days and then 1 more like upper back biased. So it might be the first day of the week is more lats, then midweek I do like an upper back, and then end of the week, hey, let's go for lat width again. And then I put my chest on the back burner, and I might do like kind of a chest day, and then more of a like shoulders and tricep day along with the back, and then like a chest day again. So chest was really at 2 times a week frequency, with like a little bit during the midweek, but mostly on the back burner anyway. So it was recovering pretty quickly. And I did tend to find that I could get a good stimulus from not that many sets. It wasn't that my volume demands were, say, much above like 20, where we have some research indicating that you probably don't want to go much above 10 to 12 sets for a muscle group within a session. I think that has been put into question more recently. Again, it's one of those things where it's like, probably don't want a hard rule of you must not go above 10 sets for a muscle group within a session. There's so many nuanced discussions that you need to have surrounding that, like where are they coming from, who is it, all of that. But so that's where I was with kind of upper body and that my reasoning there. Then legs, of course, quads, wanting to bring those up. I still find my quads just get a potent stimulus from not many sets, but they don't tend to get that sore and beat up. So they just had a quick, to put it in, I guess Mike Israetel terms, like stress response adaptation curve, like that SRA curve is pretty quick, but that within session to get like a potent stimulus was maybe 3 to 4 sets. So it's like I could do 3 to 4 sets 3 times a week and accumulate some like higher quality volume by spreading out the work. And in my off season, I'm not there yet, but in my off season, like I'm eager to train, want to get in there, like, and can give plenty of time towards sessions. And so if there's diminishing returns past a certain point with volume, I'm happy to go into diminishing returns if that means I get optimal growth in that sense, like quote unquote optimal growth. And then hamstrings basically were a bit on the back burner. So I do a couple of those days I think at one point, actually, I made one of the leg days just completely quads and then had 2 hamstrings. I would have an RDL, and that would be combined with like lighter quad work. And I'd have a belt squat in there. So it wasn't axial loaded, more rec fem work, so sissy squats, leg extensions. So I kind of undulated the work a little bit. So it'd be like, so for my back and for my quads, it'd be like a hard day, more moderate, and then like another hard day at the end of the week. And then I'd have a rest day, and then I could kind of rinse and repeat that. And yeah, I just found the recovery times were there, and I could get a good stimulus within a single session and not need to kind of go too high in volume in that single session. So yeah, I experimented with it. I think it paid off. I don't know if I don't know if I'm going to go back to it yet, though. I'm not ready for 3 times a week. I'm not mentally ready.
Oh, you're muted, ET.
Sorry about that. I was just saying legs 3 times a week is like very savage. You know, like twice a week is tough. 3 times a week is, I don't know, some kind of like self-punishment, you know?
Something, I'll just mention this quickly. Something I'm really careful about, because I think I have a tendency towards this. I think a lot of people do, is this more is better mentality, especially with how convincing some of the literature is surrounding volume and how if you can do more, like you can earn more. But before volume and quantity, I'm so careful not to let my quality drop, even subconsciously. Subconsciously, knowing I have 3 leg days, I wonder if there's any part of me that holds back, because I'm like, well, you got 3, so you can't go too hard. So I'm just careful to be like, even legs today I did 3 sets of my main quad movement. I was like, maybe I'll do a 4th. I was like, Steve, you've progressed on last week. Your legs are blown up. Just hold here, because if you add a 4th, part of me worries that psychologically, I know there was 4 sets and be concerned about that and hold back. Whereas if I have 3, hey, I can go really, really hard. So I just, I'm aware of my tendency to go towards that and make sure that quality is at the forefront before quantity.
I feel like of all the topics we've discussed so far, there's a common thread, which is to not lose the forest for the trees. And coming back, another way to say that is to not lose sight of like, what are some of the major principles? And we have a relatively broad audience, from like experienced trainees that listen to this podcast to newer trainers. And I'd be really curious if you'd be willing to perhaps flesh out what are some of like the really, really big principles that you prioritize for muscle gain specifically.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think it's something we've obviously mentioned a number of times. It's been like, maybe some people are like, hey, what are these? Like, remind me.
What are these magical things, you know?
And
Pay to
that
find
saying,
out.
yeah, that saying, missing the forest for the trees, it works perfectly here. And it's funny because you guys probably get it too, where a lot of the people you coach have made the mistakes you've made, and that's why they've kind of selected you, because you talk about it. And so it's really, really nice to be able to help these people where, I don't know, they come to you and their program is like, everything's like 30 sets or something like this. Wow. You're going to be uncomfortable with this, but we're going to have to strip this back big time. And so, yeah, when I think about training principles for hypertrophy, obviously the biggest one is specificity. So what you do within your program needs to be, when you ask, is this going to promote hypertrophy? The answer needs to be yes. So if you have a opposable squat in there, it's like, unless you're like a complete novice who's never trained before, Ryan, ET, you're not going to be growing your quads from a opposable squat. So it's no good. But like, it could be an Olympic lift, or, hey, a front squat. Is that the best lift for you for hypertrophy? What is the limiting factor going to be? Is it going to be your quads, or is it going to be the discomfort that you feel because you're choking? These sort of things. So yeah, specificity being number one, but that applies to then like, hey, the volume, the intensity in terms of relative and absolute, and then frequency, you could argue, kind of in there to some extent. And so you want to build your program around these big kind of principles of, hey, this isn't a hypertrophy program. A singles going to promote hypertrophy, yes, but are they the best tool? No, probably not. So I think about those things when I'm like assessing a program for specificity. Then overload be the second big one. And that means you need to meet thresholds for growth, essentially, is the way I think about it. So there's a certain amount of volume you must do for every muscle. And generally it's talked about on a week basis. Whether or not you have to, I don't really know, but most research kind of tends to talk about it on a week basis. So I think it makes sense for us too. But if you know you need 5 sets per week at least to grow X muscle, then if you're under that, we're no good. You need to meet that threshold. Now, it's a bit tricky because I think thinking about each muscle like that is challenging, because it's going to differ person to person, exercise to exercise, like what's your RPE or RAR. Like, there's lots of things that go into that. And so you just need to have an awareness of, I need to do a decent amount of volume. And the way I think about it is, you want to make sure that by the end of a session, that muscle has felt challenged. And by the end of the week, you felt like you've done good work within the gym. If you feel like at the end of that session, hey, that was easy, I hate to tell you, but that's probably not meeting an overload threshold, because it needs to be stressful to disrupt homeostasis, to require a then stress response to adapt and progress. And so that also brings in another big principle, which is progressive overload. So you need to be overloading today, but then over time, the body, hopefully, it'll have to adapt. And if you don't progress that overload, it will no longer meet this threshold of overload. So we've got kind of volume. So it needs to feel like a challenging amount of work to you. And then we have relative intensity. You have an overload threshold for that, which I think practically should probably be around 3 RAR for most people. Like, hey, a 7 RPE, 3 RAR. If you're not confident you're at least meeting that, then you may be sacrificing some gains. And these are like overload thresholds for like considerable growth, not just any growth, because we can probably grow a little bit from very little, but I don't think anyone's very interested in like very little growth. We want like that kind of minimum, very like efficacious growth threshold, I would say. So I kind of think about a 3 RAR as being that point. And then probably load, you just don't really want to go above 30 repetitions. And so picking a load that's like less than like 30, like your 30 rep max in that sense, unless you've got BFR cuffs on, then maybe you can use like a 20% of your 1 rep max. That's torturous though. But even practically, I tend to advise people to stay mostly in that 5 to 20 rep range. Tends to be really good. If you creep up above 20, it's not a problem. Even if you creep up above 30, you can still grow from that. It's probably just diminishing. It's not as good growth or as efficient growth as being within the other range, similar to below 5 reps is probably just inefficient because of the fatigue cost that you get there. It's not to say you can't grow from that. Essentially, hard sets, so any set that's like an RAR of 3 or more, like you're meeting a threshold. So with those thresholds in mind, and then progressing those over time, and then the next big one, and this is probably the 3 biggest ones, would be specificity, overload, progressive overload, and then fatigue management would be my next kind of big principle. Past that, they're kind of much more in the weeds, much less important, those 3 big ones. So you want to make sure that, you're not trashed all the time, and that your performance is in a good spot. That's probably the most objective way to say, am I managing fatigue well, is if my performance is in a good place and I'm at least recovering performance, but hopefully building performance on a week-to-week basis. If you see your performance dipping, especially consecutively, that's where things like deloads would come in to bring down that fatigue to continue to push on. So it kind of brings in that fitness fatigue model of like, hey, just like when you're in a surplus, you're going to gain muscle, hopefully if you're doing all the training right, and you're going to gain fat. Like fat is the cost of doing business, similar to if you're going to gain fitness adaptations and gain muscle and get stronger, fatigue is the cost of doing that because you're meeting a stress response, or sorry, a stressful threshold. And at some point, I think there seems to be some debate on this, and I'm open to being wrong here, but it would fundamentally disagree with all my experience as a coach and client, as a trainee. Fatigue accumulates. So over time, we're eventually going to get to a point where that kind of fatigue starts to mask the fitness gains we're getting. And so the difference between the two being performance. So that's where the performance plateau and potential dip would come in. So you want to kind of back off when that happens. You'll probably get some leading indicators of overreaching potentially. And so then you can kind of refresh and then go again and move your way through this. So obviously, like I said, there's deloads, rest days, kind of various programming that you can do to manipulate kind of fitness and fatigue in that way. But those would be the big rocks that I would be looking at. And obviously you can dive into that with like exercise selection and all these various things. But I think whilst exercise selection as just a fundamental thing is important, these bigger things surmount that. I would say they're underneath. And then you build kind of exercise selection on top of that and other elements. Hopefully that was clear enough. Sometimes I feel like I kind of go so all over the place.
No, it was great, man. I think you not only hammered like the essentials, but you also provided really great examples of those to make it really concrete for folks. So I thought that was really great.
Good.
Well, it's really interesting as well. You know, I don't know if you see, I'm like nodding along as you're going.
I thought you were falling asleep.
Yeah, that too. Well, I do think it's technically the earliest for me here, although it's like noon.
Yeah.
Like we are incredibly aligned. Like a lot of the language that you're using is very, very, very similar to how I think both ET and I will teach and coach, you know, either students or clients. And I think that that's something that's always really interesting within this space. And I'm kind of circling back a little bit here because you had mentioned Mike and the leg extensions. I think within the fitness space, most of us probably agree on 90 or 95%. And I think it's something that's really healthy is to have people who you are predominantly aligned with, like, respect, etc., and disagree. So, you know, ET and I have known each other a decade. We're probably aligned on the, you know, major pillars, and we don't agree on everything. Similarly, like, you know, I've not talked to Mike as often as you have, but I've had the opportunity to meet Mike as well. I would consider him to be a really big influence in my own fitness journey, and I don't agree with him on everything as well. I'm curious from your perspective, how with those people who you otherwise maybe look up to or at least highly respect, when you don't agree with their stance on something, either maybe just internally or potentially with them, like how would you approach disagreeing with them on a particular topic?
Yeah, really good question. I think it makes sense that most in the evidence-based space agree on the majority, because I think it's the little nuanced things that you're able to have an opinion on. And I did find for a while, I was like, how could I ever disagree with someone like Mike Israetel? He is fundamentally so much more intelligent than me and has way more experience. He has a PhD. and I look up to him massively. And there was a time where I wouldn't question him. He's my guru. He knows all. But again, we're all subject to our own experiences, our biases, and there are bits of research. I think even I recently interviewed Samuel Buckner, who I think is a good disruptor a little bit at the moment, where he's putting his voice out there, and it's a little bit contrary to some of the other pillarheads in our industry and within the evidence-based space. But he kind of put it towards, I think it was the recent paper on range of motion with Jeff Nippard, who kind of, I think he funded it for the most part, where I was looking at full ROM versus lengthened partials. And he kind of walked through it and was like, you could have this interpretation, and that would be your opinion of that paper. And I could have this interpretation. That's my opinion. They can both be like right. They could both be wrong. And there could be someone else with another interpretation. I think, and I've definitely been subject to this before, where I've viewed everyone has this, like the paper says what it says. It's like a math equation, right? 5 + 5 is 10. So if this research comes out, it comes out with this outcome, and that's the answer. But no, there could be 5 people looking at that and they all get a different answer from it. And I think it's just being comfortable with that uncertainty. And again, science is never knowing. It's always just like trying to find the answer. And we're all going to be slightly biased, and we're all going to layer that on top of our experiences. And I discovered that kind of early with the podcast, because I had some of the roundtables, which I'd love to do again. They're probably going to be almost impossible to do with those individuals at this moment in time because of partly the growth and popularity of Mike Israetel, because he's just exploded, but just trying to, all of them have grown in popularity and so more challenging to get on. But yeah, Mike, Eric, and Menno, and these guys all think slightly differently past those big first principle rocks. They think like deloads comes to mind. Like Menno liked his I guess he would deload certain muscles at various times. I forget what he actually calls those, like reactive deloads type of thing. And Mike, for a time, I think liked like pre-planned deloads a little bit, and then like with a bit of auto-regulation. And then Eric was somewhere in the mix of the middle of that. And so it's just interesting to hear them talk. And then it's like, oh, actually, Mike uses light days. Maybe they're a bit similar to like Menno's like reactive kind of deloading. And there's just different ways of painting that picture. Like they've all got the paintbrushes and the ink and the big principles there, and then how they interpret, hey, draw a, I don't know, horse and carriage, like, and all their drawing is going to look different, but it's still a horse and carriage. It's still what you asked for. So yeah, with the podcast in mind, I've always taken the role of student within the podcast, and I don't think that's wrong, because for the most part, I talk to experts, and like I said, they've got leagues of experience and knowledge above me. As I've gained more of that, I still take that student approach, but there are times of which I get tempted to come back. But at the same time, I've invited them on to share their knowledge, and it's depending on the person. I personally hate debates, so I don't enjoy it. It's funny, me and Pascal sometimes on the Improvement Season podcast that we run have disagreed, kind of similar like you guys. Like you agree on most things, but sometimes you just won't agree on everything. And we've had some, and I find them uncomfortable. He doesn't care. He quite likes debating. Whereas I'm like, oh, I don't like that we're disagreeing with business partners and like we're coaches. So yeah, I find it a little bit difficult, but as I'm gaining confidence in myself for who I am and what I know, I'm more open to it. And I would just always do it in a kind of, I don't know if it's considerate way. I would be like, I wouldn't go into it with being like, hey, I disagree with that. I'd be like, have you considered this? What do you think about this? It's like, oh, that's interesting. You think that way. There's people that think this. This tends to be my opinion, like that sort of thing. And just being open to that dialogue. And I think that's something I could do better on the podcast. I think the audience would probably enjoy it too, because there's definitely people listening who would think similar to me, and they'd probably appreciate me questioning and also allowing that other person to consider that perspective and opinion and see what they think to it as well. But in the moment, it can be hard. Sometimes you guys probably do this if you bring people on, you reflect upon that episode like later that day or following days. You're like, man, I wish I said this, or I wish I'd questioned them about that. And yeah, I mean, you can't be perfect in the moment.
I'm sure ET will have a question, but I think this is potentially a good segue to maybe talking about your experience within your podcast and as a host. And actually something, ET and I will have discussions about guests that we bring on, about, what makes this person unique, like what sort of value would they bring for people who are listening to this, etc. And one of the things that I had actually said, I'm not just brown nosing here. I was like, historically, I think two of the podcasts that I have listened to for the longest and the most consistently and really enjoyed is the Modern Wisdom podcast and then the Revive Stronger podcast. And I think a lot of that actually, and I'm saying this actually as an affirmation of not necessarily disagreeing with your guests on air. As you said, you brought them on, they're sort of doing a favor, taking their time. But I think you do a very, very good job as a host, giving space for your guests, allowing the conversation to really flesh out. I think that's something where I don't know if you have practiced this or if it's a really concerted effort. I know Chris on the Modern Wisdom podcast has talked about this before. I don't know how much of that is just your like natural disposition and how much of it is just how much of that is also you practicing the skills as a host. But I think you do a very good job giving space, directing the conversation. I tend to not be very interested in podcasts that are just people talking shit for 2 hours and there's just nothing to learn from it. As opposed to something like the Revive Stronger podcast, I know that I'm going to take away something from the conversation that you have with the guest. So I guess my question there is, are those skills that you actually try to cultivate and practice?
I appreciate that a lot. I listen to the Modern Wisdom podcast as well. And it's funny, I listen to Chris and I'm like, man, he is such a good host. And I, in part, listen to it because sometimes I just want to expose myself to how he does it, to try and learn. Sometimes the best way to learn is everyone knows this. If you train with someone who's better than you, like you pick up things from that person, and it can be really exposing sometimes of like how much you can learn from spending that time with them. So anyway, yeah, I try and expose myself to him because I think he does a great job of interviewing guests as well. So I can see why you like him because I also like that. And in regards to like letting people speak, I would be remiss to say that it was like all just like practice and learn or what have you. It's my natural nature is to be that kind of, let's say, strong silent type. I like to sit back, let other people ride the conversation for the most part. But it does also depend. You probably notice it with some guests I might have a stronger relationship with and a bit more rapport with. And so it's a little bit more bouncy and a bit more back and forth. Whereas others, it's very much like, you go, and then, okay, they're finished. Now I can go. And yeah, I think because I've been running the podcast for so long, I've managed to develop like rapport with some guests who are repeat guests. And I also have got more confident in myself as an interviewer. So even if I haven't had someone on many times, there's no one that comes to mind in particular. But like I said, there's some like younger PhDs coming into the field. And I think sometimes I just assume that they'd be, for the most part, I assume people coming on the podcast are more confident than I am, very happy and open to chat. But actually, the podcast has grown to a point where it's like it gets listened to by quite a lot of people. There's people like Mike Israel have been on, so like people find that intimidating. The fact that I've interviewed such people, I don't think they find me intimidating per se, but being live like on a podcast, they might. So in those certain circumstances, I've been a bit better at like social cueing, and I'm quite empathetic just as a person, so I can kind of read them. It's actually funny because you guys use Riverside. I've contemplated Riverside, but I've used it a few times with other podcasts, and sometimes the video quality can be poor. So I don't know how well I come through to you, but sometimes it can get a bit squarey. But the other, like it records really well and it's much better output. But I so strongly rely on social cueing and visually seeing what that person is looking like to kind of navigate the conversation. I couldn't let go of Zoom, which is what I use. So yeah, I think a lot of it is just genetics and how I've grown up and so on and so forth. But thankfully over like, I don't know how long it's been, like 7 years, over 400 podcast episodes now, I think I've learned kind of the skill. I've leveled up just through exposure and experience of doing it. And then getting feedback like you said there, Ryan, you like it that I let the individual speak. I get that all the time said to me. So it's like very reinforcing to like let them do that. Sometimes I catch myself with those less confident guests speaking over them even. And I'm like, oh, Steve, like shove that tongue back in, like rail it in, like let them speak. So yeah, I think it's mostly, thankfully, like a just genetic, like personality trait, but definitely I do try and learn and get better over time.
There's one, many things stand out from what you just shared, but one thing, you mentioned that you're at 400 plus episodes. Congratulations on that. That's
Thank you.
huge. Thinking of like, as someone who, hosts one, co-hosts with Ryan, there's all the back end stuff that's required as a means of getting these things on air, et cetera. So I know how much work goes into it. It's only gotten easier, and and it still is a decent amount of work now. So going back, to when, the beginning of your podcast, 400 plus episodes ago, the fact that you've managed to continue with the habit of putting out content regularly is really impressive. And I say that because I can relate to the very real effort it takes to put out something that you genuinely really give a shit about and that you're proud about, or proud of, excuse me. So I tip my metaphorical hat to you, and it's a metaphorical hat because I look like shit when I wear hats. But one thing that really stands out for me is, and I'm curious whether or not you would agree, is that it's a fundamental requirement in life, generally speaking, if you want to excel, is to get really comfortable being absolutely atrocious at something at the beginning. And I'd be curious, like, have you gone back and listened to some of your cringeworthy episodes, like episode 1 through 10? You know what I mean? Like when was the last time that you did that? How has that whole process gone? How do you deal with failure, etc.?
Yeah, very good question. So I have, and it's actually interesting. I've probably more regularly gone back because I started YouTube before I started the podcast, and so I have always liked social media. I don't know what it is about it. I've always liked it. So I would do vlogs. So I'd like vlog my training, and it was just like a journey of sharing my bodybuilding and what I learned and sharing that with other people. So it's actually funny that thread has continued through to now. And man, some of those are terrible. I know for some of them I was trying. Matt August was a big inspiration for me. You guys might be aware of that, but also it's like the Hodge twins were big back then as well.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So I, in some videos,
erections all over my body.
Oh my God.
And those guys must have, I think that's probably part of their personality, but I think they were playing up to the camera, especially the Hodge twins. And so I tried to do that. And I was like, man, those are so cringe.
Yeah.
And I don't know when it happened, but there became a point where if it was exhaustion or I was just like, I'm just going to be myself. And so that really helped kind of get over that. But still, I look back at some of these videos and I'm like, man, Steve, you're so badly spoken. And like, what even was that? But with the podcast, man, and you said like the back end and everything, thankfully, quality of podcasts, if you have the quality I had, if I launched my podcast episodes like the first ones now, I don't think anyone would listen because the audio was bad. My internet connection was really bad. I didn't edit it. I just threw it out there. So like they were bad for so many reasons, but also like my ability to like have conversations, have again confidence in what I was saying, and even being able to understand what the other person was trying to tell me and go through with things. Yeah, it's like you guys said, it's you have to try things to get better at them. It reminds me of quite a lot of my clients are coaches themselves, and I have one who just did his first competition this last year, and he's told me how eager he is to coach other competitors to stage, and he was really doubting himself. This woman reached out to him and wants to like be a figure next year, and he was like, Steve, what do I do? Like, I've done Lane Norton's course, I've done your course with JPS, and I really want to get into coaching people to stage, but I'm uncertain. It's also a female, not a male, which makes it a bit harder. And I was like, dude, you know more than enough. You're a great coach. Just do it. Like, seriously, just go do it. You got to put yourself out there. You got to learn somehow. And I was like, if you tell her like everything you feel like, hey, I'm inexperienced and blah, 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 but I have the confidence that I'm going to be able to take you to stage. And she still says, yeah, I want you to be my coach. Go for it and have confidence. And like, you're going to make mistakes, but mistakes make you better and learn. So yeah, for sure. I think a lot of people get uncertain about putting themselves out there and making a fool of themselves. And it's that imposter syndrome we all feel still probably. And yeah, you just realize no one really gives a shit.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think, it's the journey is probably not context specific because, we're very new with the podcast kind of in its current format, but we've both been in the fitness industry for over a decade. And I also reflect on things I did with clients very early on. And I want to just like bury my head in the sand. I'm like, oh my God, like what was I thinking? Like I remember even like the first diet plan I ever wrote. I'm like, how did this person not die? Like this was horrible. Just like slash their calories. Anyway, it was horrific. And like, thank God, they ended up okay. And, 8, 9, 10 years later, hopefully I've learned a thing or two, but it's interesting to reflect on. Cause I also think in this industry, we were chatting about this as well in relation to podcasting, whatever else. In particular, if you want to be like an online coach, you have to exist, I think, in the social media space. And I'll admit, and I think Steve, you and I probably have somewhat similar dispositions in this sense. Like I don't love being the center of attention. And it is grating against my personality to make myself the center of attention at times. And if you want to succeed kind of in this space, you almost have to be. Like you have to be the center of attention. And I think very similar to you, this is something that's come up a variety of times because I launched my company in March of last year. I left full-time PT, started my company then, started working out full-time September of last year. Actually, right around when you and I met in London was like right when I had left doing one-on-one personal training as my full-time gig. And I remember trying to create content similar to what I had seen, like using that as a template. Found it very arduous, didn't enjoy it, felt really uncomfortable. As you said, like you're almost like playing a bit that felt very inauthentic. And it had like middling success. And the inflection point was actually during my most recent contest prep because I was just too damn tired to do it. And it started to become a lot more raw. And then everything started to get more popular. And it was just being authentic. I don't know if you would have similar advice to maybe those who are somewhat green in the space. It sounds like really cliche advice, but I think there's an element of knowing yourself and playing up to that when you're sort of presenting yourself to people out in the online world.
Yeah, it's funny how contest prep really kind of reveals. I can't say the true person, but it does make you a bit more transparent. The things that irritate you a little bit in your off season will be unbelievably grating during your prep. And yeah, you become a little bit more like almost too honest and too uncaring. And I can't remember. I've said it to some people, but I've spoken to people that they're like, I almost like that little bit of you that becomes a little bit more like edgy during your prep. Because generally I'm really concerned about how the other person perceives me and that they're happy, because that's just my disposition. I'm very much like put other people first generally. So yeah, it's the revealing portion of prep. There's elements of it I like that it draws from me, and it kind of reveals what's truly important. But I think it's like, we draw it back to a diet analogy. What do people say? The best diet is the one that you can sustain the longest in terms of like a dietary philosophy. If you can't sustain it, it's probably not particularly useful to you to be following. And when you are playing to the camera and playing up to the camera, it's very grating, it's very tiring, probably unsustainable. Whereas when you're yourself and you lean into what you enjoy, that will come out onto the camera or to your posts. It doesn't necessarily have to even be video. If you really enjoy, don't know, graphics or whatever it might be. Of course, you have to play to the medium to some extent. You don't want to be putting out, I don't know if you can even put out hour-long videos on Instagram, but you don't want to make content that doesn't fit with the platform. But you can still play to what you enjoy and lean into that for sure. And that's definitely something I've learned over time, is whenever I try and do something that has too many kind of friction points, it's just I'm not gonna sustain it. And yeah, I kind of, as soon as I feel that friction, I'm careful about moving forward with it as well, because it just becomes unsustainable. So I completely agree with you, Ryan. Like, be authentically you, I think, is super important.
I'd like to bring it back to your podcast for a moment. There's been a few guests that you've mentioned on a variety of occasions today so far. You mentioned Kasim from N1, Mike Israetel, and Milo Wolf. And I know that you've hosted the three of them on your podcast, I believe on at least once each, or perhaps on numerous occasions. I'm not entirely certain. But I'd be curious to know from each of those guests, was there something that in particular that stands out that you can recall from your episodes with those guests, that really stands out as something that you learned or perhaps that reframed how you do your work? Does anything come to mind?
I'm laughing because something really stupid comes to mind for Mike, but people might find this funny. This was, I don't know if funny or whatever it is, but I think there's a good take home from it anyway. One of the earliest episodes with Mike, I remember telling him that, and we're talking about supplementation. I was like, hey, I just supplement with beta-alanine when I am doing like metabolic work because it will help me in those higher rep ranges and when I'm trying to drive more reps and kind of drive those metabolites. And he was like, why would you take beta-alanine that buffers metabolites, which is exactly the thing you're trying to gain during those exercises? You're having to do more work for the same outcome. And so actually you could just end up being more efficient by not taking it. And I was like, holy shit. Like the way Mike initially appealed to me because he disrupted my kind of space in terms of I was following 3DMJ for the most part and the way they would talk about things. And everyone seemed to kind of align. And then Mike came in and I started reading his stuff. And it's like, Mike thinks differently. And it's kind of similar to that. You can read a paper and there could be 5 different opinions. Mike just had a fundamentally different view of evidence and science and the way he would present things. And of course, very entertaining and well-spoken. And so, yeah, it was just that sense of, like, obviously, people can take home beta-alanine for hypertrophy, probably not something you need to worry about. But it was thinking about things from, like, think outside the box sometimes. Like, make sure you think about things from every angle, or don't just disregard someone because they think differently, because they might just be having a different perspective. So, yeah, it's cool when people come at things and they've come to the same viewpoint from different avenues. That's very confirming, but that doesn't always happen. So I would say that was something I learned from Mike, was like just trying to think outside the box sometimes. And I guess bring it back to first principles in many ways. That was because it was like, we're trying to gain, what are we trying to do? What is that thing doing? It's actually counter to the thing we're trying to do. Like, so that was really good from Mike. And that was like, again, one of the first episodes I ever did with him. It's like mind blown. Like,
Cool.
This guy thinks different. Milo. So obviously the length and partial work has been really great. And also knowing that he came from a very biased perspective in terms of like, he was team for Rom all the way. But I would probably say with Milo is I am really taken back when you discover his age. I actually don't know how old Milo is off the top of my head, but I wouldn't be surprised. I think he's sub 25. Like, he is a young individual. And
Really? I had no idea.
Like, he looks full grown, right? Because he's quite hairy, he has a big beard, and like, he's muscly, like, he's a big guy. But also the way he speaks and presents himself, it's like, he speaks in a really, really articulate way, obviously incredibly intelligent. But I think, yeah, that's something, seeing his growth within the space has been pretty inspirational and kind of, again, a bit mind-blowing, because he came to, I forget which year it was, but it was maybe like 2020, or no, it must have been the one before COVID. So it must have been like 2019. He came to a seminar and that we presented with Mike Israetel, and he was kind of like a nobody. Like, really, he was a nobody. Whereas now, if like, he's throwing his own seminars, like, number of years later, and he's still in his early 20s, I believe. So like, cool. The fact that like his YouTube now has more subscribers than mine, and like, he's actually just opened up a gym, a private gym with Dr. Pack, and they're going to film content in there. They've actually just recently invited me over to go do a session in the new year and film content. But to see someone come into the space and like, just like have that rise to fame has been really, really cool. But I think what people might take from that is like, I don't know, luck or something like that. Like, oh, he grew from nowhere. But no, he spent years on that bottom side of the iceberg, similar to Mike Israetel in many ways. Like, his rise to fame, like over the last couple of years, has been like, yeah, boom. But you look at all the content over the years that Mike's been doing, all the work, all the PhD, all the students he's spoken to, all the courses he's done, all the podcasts he's been on. Like, it's that groundwork. It's similar with Milo. Like, he's got his PhD, he's been working, grinding away at all of that, and then off the base of that, he's been able to kind of build a big foundation and grow through it. So that's been very inspirational, seeing that from Milo. And then with Kassem, I think I really respect Kassem for one thing that at least comes to mind, and why I really grew to become fond of him, was he's quite retrospective. Is that the word? Where I know what put me off N1 and Kassem initially was they'd have quite a lot of content that was like excise, and it would have like a red X, and then it would have like a green tick next to the other one. And they've just completely moved away from that. And he's very nuanced in the way that he discusses things, and he never attacks the person. He only ever disagrees with content, so he never does ad hominems, which you see all the time within our space.
Absolutely.
Within the space in general, and they suck. Like, I saw you rolling your eyes, Ryan. Like,
Yeah.
grinds your gears, no doubt. So Kassem does a great job of, like, he doesn't ostracize people when he disagrees with them. He's just like, takes the data for what it is, puts his opinion out there, and then allows discourse. I've never spoken to Kassem and been like, would you be open to talking to this person or whoever it might be, and him being like, no. He's always like, I'm open to debate, I'm open to learn more. And when I think of people who aren't dogmatic, Kassem is one of the people that come to mind. And I think years ago, I would have looked at him and be like, he's quite dogmatic, like in the way he views things. But I think maybe he wasn't as dogmatic as I thought, but also he's grown to become much more open-minded. And he really, I know he loves exposing himself to stuff that's different to his own opinion. And I credit him to that. So yeah, I didn't know I actually feel like I had 3 good answers for you there. I wasn't sure if I would.
Great.
Yeah, it was pretty bang on. We actually, on the heels of that, we have some rapid fire questions prepared for you. So Ryan, I'll let you lead the way.
So we always do this at the end with any of our guests the first time that they're on. We haven't had a B back yet. So essentially, really quick questions. First thing that pops on the top of your head. Holy. Personal questions, just as quick as you can. Cool?
Okay. Yeah. I've got you.
So question 1 is, what is your favorite book, movie, and concert?
Oh, damn, book. Man, I haven't read anything for so long. Why does practical... No, I can't say that. The first thing that came to mind was Practical Programming by Mark Ripperto, but it's because of what we've been talking about. Gosh. Oh, okay. I'm going to say, I've got it over there. The Stress of Life, I'm going to say, actually. I know, again, it's a bit of a nerdy answer. I don't really read like fiction. I read mostly non-fiction. But The Stress of Life by Hans Sayé, that kind of revealed quite a lot out of like the first principle thinking. It is quite good for that, like talking about the stress response and everything there. Then what was after book?
Movie and concert.
Movie. Oh, gosh. The first thing that comes... The Pursuit of Happiness is the first thing that comes to mind. Now, if I thought about it a bit longer, I don't think it would be. But I just really... It's a good film movie. Like, bare bones. Yeah. It's kind of a lot of what anime is based off, where it's like they're at the bottom and they rise to the top. It was kind of that with that film. So it's a very feel-good, Will Smith, like, enjoyable one for me. And then, did you say concert was the last one? Gosh. I'm gonna say no. I don't like concerts. That's gonna be my answer. I would never choose to go to a concert. So that's like, okay. I like listening to music like within my workouts, but outside of that, I'm quite like, it's like too much.
Sensory overload.
Yes.
All right. What is your favorite and least favorite food?
Favorite's definitely pizza. No brainer. A good pizza. Although the meme I like is like, pizza's like sex. Even when it's bad, it's good.
Yeah.
I just came back from New York, so had a variety of different pizzas there, so that was good. And then least favorite. Oh, I think this is going to sound weird, but it's everything when I'm peak mass. Like, it's just the worst.
I get that.
Being in peak mass, I get to the point where I could just... Like, right now, I love oats, but I couldn't eat oats. There's no chance. Like, all food sucks. So I'm just going to say everything at peak max. Even pizza, to be honest, is bad when I'm peak mass.
What is your proudest moment outside of business?
Huh. The
I mean, I
immediate thing
see
that,
something in the
yeah,
background
yeah.
there.
The immediate thing that comes to mind is the pro card, but I think more than that pro card is what led to that. So it's knowing that despite 10 years ago coming like bottom of the pack in a novice show, I never gave up towards the goal of achieving that pro card. So it's not necessarily the pro card for itself, but it's the journey it represents, I would say.
Here,
Sounds like a
here.
good answer.
Hell yeah, that's great.
Favorite athlete growing up?
Ooh, I think it was probably, I think I was pretty fond of footballers. And who was my favorite? Like, I don't think it was like a David Beckham or anything. I quite liked Ian Wright for a while. If you guys know Ian Wright, uh, you might not. He was he was also British, and he was pretty good. He played for Arsenal. Do you know Arsenal soccer
Yes.
football
Yeah.
club?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, maybe Ian Wright. No one immediately comes to mind, so I'm going to say him.
Cool.
What three values guide you?
Good question. I would say like discipline, that comes to mind. Doing what I say, and kind of being, it sounds weird, being a good person, being kind. They're the three that kind of come to mind.
Favorite and least favorite lift?
Ooh. Favorite lift at the moment, because it changes like the weather almost. Leg press, but like toe leg press at the moment. I'm really jiving with like letting the heels rise a little bit. The quad pump is just like, there's nothing like it. It's a good Arnie moment, like, nothing better than the pump. And do you say least favorite exercise?
Least favorite, yeah.
It might be the abs, just abs in general, actually. Any ab flexion, I got to do it because abs are a thing and they look good. But man, I like training them the least.
Yeah.
What's one misconception about you?
I don't know if it's a misconception, but it's something I feel. I think a lot of people think I'm like really nice and soft and all of that. And I guess I am, but I think maybe it sometimes can be misconstrued that I can never be like hard and tell people how it is. And you have to be, the saying is you have to be cruel to be kind. So I can be cruel. And I'm also definitely not perfect. Like I have flaws. My girlfriend would tell you, like, yeah, you can be a dickhead sometimes. So on social media, that's I think sometimes how lots of people can come across as like not flawless, but like, hey, they're just always the nicest person ever. It's like, I mean, I could be nicer at times. I could be vegan and care for the animals a bit more. That's something because my girlfriend's vegan, so that's immediately on mind.
City or country that you would love to visit?
Oh, Tokyo, Japan.
Okay.
Immediate.
And
Yeah.
our final question: what is one hard truth that personal trainers or coaches who are trying to grow their business need to hear?
It's going to take more time. All of it. It will take more time. Similar to that kind of looking at the rise to fame of Mike or a Milo, like that did not happen overnight. An overnight success is one that won't be sustained. So be ready to put in the work for years and just be consistent and fall in love with the process of helping people.
Beautiful. It's interesting. That's an almost identical answer to Paulo Need, who was our last guest that we had on here. He's a gentleman based out of Ottawa, educator, trainer, coach. And he said essentially the same thing, that it's just like fall in love with the process. It's going to take time. There's no shortcuts, and I would agree with you. What's the expression where it's like they were an overnight success? They were a success overnight or something along those. But in any case, I'm butchering this. But I agree with you. It takes a long time, in the same way that it takes a long time for a flame to boil water, but then it boils all in one instant. It's because of all of the work that happened leading up to that moment,
Yeah.
And I think that at least for me, I've not only learned a lot from you today, which I'm really grateful for, but it's the way that you approach subject matter is really refreshing. I really like how open-minded you are and critical, and in many ways, I would say like emotionally neutral to what you speak about, and your willingness to change your opinion when presented with evidence. I think you model that in a really fantastic way, and I'm really really happy and very glad that you have a microphone and you have a voice and you have a platform, so like people can learn from you, and very very much model that, because I think that's something that our industry needs more of, more nuance and less like polarized individuals who dig their heels in the sand when it comes to their stances. So I just wanted to make sure that, how would I say that I state that, I think, just very clearly and overtly. I think that's really fantastic values that you bring to the table, and I hope that people can, if there's one thing that they take from this episode, are those values and those practices of yours. Sorry, go
I
ahead.
really appreciate. I just want to say I really appreciate that, ET. That's so nice to hear. Honestly, it's really humbling, actually.
When it comes to, for folks that perhaps have stumbled upon your work for the first time on this podcast, where could they learn more about you, follow you, perhaps invest in some of your seminars, courses, etc.? How could they go about doing that?
Yeah, for sure. So basically, Revive Stronger. If you search that on any podcast platform or YouTube, will pop up. Our website is revivestronger.com, and I am Revive Stronger over on Instagram. So yeah, that's where I'm most present, is Instagram, like my personal stuff. Like I said, do some vlogs now and then. They come out onto the YouTube channel. And yeah, our coaching and everything is over on the website, revivestronger.com. Thank you guys so much for having me. It's been a blast.
Yeah, thank you, Steve.
Thank you, man. Honestly, it's been a total pleasure, and hopefully it won't be the last time that we connect.
For sure. I'd love to do it.